The sun has left and forgotten me. It's dark, I cannot
Your stories don't define
see.
you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief storymaker at Elkins Consulting. Whether you're sharing a personal story or a professional story, how you share that story matters. It can change how people perceive you, and it can impact your own internal dialogue, the messages that you send about yourself. If you're curious about how to tell exactly the right story in the right way at your next interview, remember that my course, Job Interview Storytelling, is now available on Udemy. You can find the link on my website at elkinsconsulting.com. Listeners, your guests today might surprise you, but it won't surprise you that I met them in random places, put them together, they had never met before, and we are now recording this episode of the podcast because of a common area of interest. So I'd love to welcome my friends Chris Wang and Emily McVey. Chris, I met on a hike in northwestern Montana, and my aunt and uncle and I were hiking back from a waterfall, and he was hiking toward the waterfall, and his dog caught my attention. Now, that won't surprise any of our listeners. I started to play with the dog and pet the dog, and then, of course, we met the dog's owner. So welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks, Sarah.
And Emily has actually lived in the same town as I have for a long time, and we connected once before, but then earlier this year, we reconnected when she gave this amazing workshop on suicide awareness and prevention. And what really struck me about the way she presented this concept and all of the strategies and statistics is that it could have been either very dry or very sad and depressing. And she managed to make it neither of those things. She included some of those statistics that are distressing and disturbing, while also giving us solid strategies. She added her own sense of humor to it and made it feel like a practical workshop that we could apply to all parts of our lives. So I knew that she'd make a great guest on this podcast. Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So listeners, the reason I brought these two together is that they are exceptions to the rule in quite a few ways. I found out just through individual conversations with them that they both grew up in very difficult circumstances. There were toxic environments in their home lives. And somehow they came to this place where I met them as mentally and emotionally healthy human beings, people who could accept, receive, and give love and support. And that's my definition of emotional wellness. And so many times we as humans focus on the negative. As you probably know, the study of psychology began by looking at neuroses. It began by looking at what was broken in people and studying those things. And then I believe it was around 30 years ago, the concept of positive psychology started to take hold, where people started to realize what we really also need to study is what went right. We need to study people who have this emotional intelligence, who have this emotional well-being, so that we can see what went right, so we can share it and fix some of this sometimes before it even begins. And these two are such great examples of this focusing on what went right. That's why I invited them to join us. So we're going to start as we often do in this podcast. I'd like to start by asking Emily to share something about herself that most people don't know about her.
I would say there's probably not a lot of things that people don't know about me. I'm a little bit of an open book. I tell people all kinds of strange things about myself. But one thing that I used to tell everybody when I was in high school, and I think I probably told people this as a bit of a for shock value, because I was really good at school. I got good grades, and I should have gone on to college with no problems. But I used to tell people instead that I was going to buy a large white station wagon and have 10 kids and just roam the country. And that was my goal in life. I didn't do that, obviously, but that was what I used to tell people what that was what I was going to do when I graduated from high school.
That's hilarious. And I bet a few people believed you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just had enough of a quirky streak in high school that people were like, well, maybe that's what she's going to do.
That's hilarious. Thank you for sharing that. Chris, what do you think? Do you have something you can share that people might not know about you?
Yeah,
It's not on your resume.
Yeah, I think most people know that I'm super into music, but I think most people don't know, like, when I was a kid, like, I listened to a lot of new age music because my dad was like super into it. But like, when I started to develop my own kind of taste for music, like, I went heavy. Like, I went through like metal and metalcore, like a lot of metal stuff. I mean, now I listen to everything, but definitely, like, if I were to tell people like I'm into metal, they're like, of course. But if I tell people I also listen to new age, they'll be like, what?
Yeah, you're a little young for the Enya music that we used to listen to in the 80s. I think.
Yeah, but like, I grew up, my dad was always playing that kind of music. I love it now. Like, now I also go to yoga class. Like, I love, the kind of music that those teachers have.
I love that. And that brings us to a good starting point for our conversation, because you and I share that love for music in very different ways, and we both listen to a lot of different music. Coping strategies. I think when the three of us got on our first call to discuss whether we could do this recording, we talked a little bit about coping strategies that we developed in our childhoods. And can you tell me a little bit about how music became a coping strategy for you when you were a kid?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how, to tell the story. So when I was growing up, part of the challenge was that I was like at home by myself a lot because my parents, both working. A lot of times, like my mom was a nurse, so she was, working shifts. My dad works for like a government agency. A lot of times he has to like, like work late. So sometimes like I'm just home by myself. As a young kid, it's kind of like a scary feeling. Like, you're like still kind of afraid of the dark, afraid of, sound. Like till this day, like I'm like sensitive to noise, to sound. I think now looking back, I think part of that has to do with, the environment that I grew up in. So like, I think initially just having like a background music, like sound, that's something that I enjoy was a way of coping. But also as I grew older, I started to listen to, or explore kind of music that I might be interested in. This is something that's actually embarrassing to talk about, but by the age when I was like in middle school, I think that's when like I started to have access to the internet and I started to use like MySpace. It was like I think at that time it was like a great way to connect with people like globally, and then you find people like who listen to like weird music as you do. For me, it's embarrassing. I got into emo music because it was just this, set to with a lot.
Every kid goes, I don't know any kids that didn't listen to some emo music in their teens. I don't know any. Like I was all about Depeche Mode. So
yeah. So that for me, like at that time, emo music was a way for me to kind of feel like I'm part of a community, or like when you feel like nobody understands you as a teenager or as a young kid, like somehow the music spoke to you. But also, I think, actually, just last night I couldn't sleep. I always kind of have sometimes I'll have sleep issues, and I started to, I don't know why, I just wanted to play some Joe Satriani. He's like, I play guitar. He's like one of my favorite guitarists. I just put some of his music on, and that really help regulate. Like now I have the tools. Like I know how to regulate my kind of body. Like now I understand how trauma works in the body. So like, I was like, I'm just gonna play some music that's actually gonna, soothe me. And as we're talking about coping, I think recently, I actually started to think about get a more clear kind of understanding of other coping mechanism, like using alcohol, which is something that I started using since college as a way. I didn't know, right? I didn't have that kind of conscious understanding. Yeah. But like now, in the last few months, like throughout all those years, like I always kind of try to revisit my relationship with alcohol, and I try to, like, I don't think I was ever kind of like full on kind of alcoholic, but it always something like I'm super into fitness, and it hinders my, goals and performance in fitness. And it makes, I'm like super into, a lot of stuff that I'm into requires like cognition and intellect. And I know a huge kind of downside of, long-term alcohol consumption is it's going to impair your cognitive function. So like knowing this kind of stuff, and, I always try to, through all those years, try to kind of work on that. I think in the last few months, like I'm like gravitating towards art a lot. Like last time we chatted, I just got a drum set. I've been playing drums a lot. And I play, guitar, and I started doing wood burning. And I've been drawing a lot. Like I try to learn. I've been trying to learn how to draw in the last 10 years. I think in the last year or so, I finally feel like I kind of figure out a way to get better at it. Yeah. So I think just art in general, but like music definitely was like a huge part of how, like there are times in my life, especially when I was younger, I just feel like there's no one I could talk to. There's no one I could reach out to. I think music was a way. I actually had this thought last night, which is like if you play music, if you play an instrument and you listen to the music, it's almost like you're having a dialogue with this person, like even though you've never seen them. And I think that can be true for like if you're reading a book, like you feel like you're having a conversation with the author.
One character in it.
Yeah. Because, maybe you read.
Feel less alone.
Yeah. So I think in that sense, art is a way to kind of, I think it's a way to connect with the creator, but also a way to connect with yourself, because like you understand like why you feel certain things, or you try to understand like why you feel certain things, like when you listen to some music, or maybe when you're, creating art or whatever.
I love that. And Emily, when you were a kid, what was a coping mechanism that when you look back, you didn't know at the time necessarily, probably, but what was one of the things that you think about in your past that you continue to use in some way?
I was an over-organizer, and I continue to be, which, can also get on the unhealthy side of things, but it actually helps me in my job and helps me, in the career that I chose. I'm really good at accounting, unfortunately, and I say that because in my jobs in nonprofit, you end up doing a lot of jobs as the nonprofit leader that you may not love to do, but you end up having to do because you might be the only person available to do it, and
you're good at it.
I'm good at this. I know unfortunately I'm good at this because for me, accounting is organizing things and numbers and spreadsheets and so that coping mechanism of organization, while, sometimes I have definitely taken it too far on the negative side of things, it has actually really benefited me in a lot of ways as an adult in my career and in my life is just being able to, be able to organize my life, my job, the skills that I need in my job, things that I do. So, it's kind of fun to think of it that way. It's not really artistic.
How do you think that manifested in your childhood? Because when I think about, my mom didn't have anything consistent. She was not a consistent person, except for we were all treated the same. And so there was some, and I kind of see that in myself. There's some level of chaos around us because we have this energy. And I remember becoming kind of bossy around my mom, especially if her sister was around. They always lived in different states, but when her twin sister would come to visit, I would get bossy. I'd be like, okay, we're going to be late. We have reservations at 7:00. We need to leave in 15 minutes. And who's going to go in which car? And I would just, get into this because I did not tolerate that chaos very well. So it manifested in this bossiness. So how do you think your intense need for organizing, how did that manifest in when you were a kid?
Oh, it was absolutely the need to be in control of something because I always say my parents were nomads, even though we really only moved around the same town. We didn't stay in a house for more than 6 months until I was in middle school. We would sometimes go to school from one house and go to a different house when we left school. So we never knew where we were going to be living from day to day. And my dad owned a car lot. Well, my parents owned a car lot together. And so we would just drive whatever car was off the lot. So we'd get dropped off in a car, get picked up in a different car. And so those were the days where we got dropped off. You'd leave a house, get dropped off in a car, get picked up in a different car, and go home to a totally different house. So life was just ever changing. We never knew what was going to be happening. So that was my absolutely need to be in control of something. And so I created, I could be in control of myself, my room, my clothes, my whatever. And so that I had to have that need to be organized within myself, within my school bag, whatever I could. And that lasted forever, to this day. I have that. And when I grew up, had kids, and my husband had a little bit of that same moving around. He would hop around towns as his parents had jobs or had a need to move from one town to the other. He wasn't consistently in the same school either. And when our oldest son started kindergarten, I said, I don't care if we live in a cardboard box on the street corner. Whatever school he starts in, that is where he stays. We are not doing this to our children. And they did. They stayed in the same schools from kindergarten through graduation of high school with the same consistent teachers, classmates, in the same community. And because it was just so chaotic to be constantly moving around, even though it was the same town, we just never knew if we were going to move schools, if we were going to move houses. One time my parents literally wrapped saran wrap around the Christmas tree, moved it from one house to the other, all the packages and everything. And we moved days before Christmas and just plopped down in a new house and started all over.
So when you think about, it didn't feel weird to you because that's just what you did. So when you think about that, growing up like that, and are there any people that I guess the word is influenced or mentored or supported you, encouraged you when you think about, my thought first for you, Emily, is a person or people who inspired you on both sides of the subject, where somebody saw your organizational skills and encouraged it and said, this is a great way to keep control of your life when everything around you, when you can't control it. maybe a teacher or some other adult in your life or a friend. And then the opposite, is there somebody in your life that was, you were organized almost to spite that person, and they inspired you to stay organized partly out of spite. Either they criticized you for it or they didn't understand it and didn't support you in it. And then, Chris, I'll ask you the same question. I'm thinking about your dad's influence in terms of music, and using that as a coping mechanism. So again, remember, we're focusing on what went right for you. So, and I truly believe that we have two different kinds of inspiration, especially as children. It comes into our adulthood too, but especially as children and teenagers, that spite influence that ends up being positive through a negative interpretation of it, and then the support influence.
I don't know that it was around the organization specifically. I think more what I saw was I've just always been really good at school, and it always sounds really terrible to say that out loud, but it's just always come natural to me, and school's easy for me. And
You probably worked hard too, right?
I don't. I enjoy it, and so it doesn't feel like work. Probably,
Okay.
So
Well, it's not a terrible thing to say. It's not a silly thing at all. Some people are just, that comes more naturally for them. And I think that's great. It definitely says a lot about who you are and your ability to manage and adapt. So,
yeah. So, I mean, even when I was a little kid, I just always got good grades. I was, always had my homework done. My teachers always really liked me. And that always caused stress with my sisters. And I think even with my parents, because neither of my parents have graduated from high school. And so that even as a small child, that caused stress for my dad, because he would actually say things like, well, you'll never be as successful as I am, even though you're smart in school. You don't have any street smarts. But then he would
comparison.
pay me to get good grades. And so he did both ends of it. He just really didn't know how to deal with me as a smart child and or not praise me. So he was on both sides of the coin there, and it would stress him out that that I was maybe going to be more successful than him, but then he was really proud that I was going to be more successful than him. He didn't have any coping skills to deal with either of those things. So that was interesting to look back on as an adult and to deal with as a child. But really, when I looked back, when I was learning about ACEs and all of these things as an adult, the people that I really see as my support people were my grandmothers. My mom's mom was really the one that was always there saying, she was there. We could do anything. We could do no wrong in her eyes. She was the one that was always there. My dad's mom really didn't like us very much when we were little kids. It wasn't until I was a little bit older that she really started to connect with me. And I don't know if she just enjoyed being around me, saw the value. I think she just, she'd always say, "You're an old soul," and just kind of started enjoying spending time with me. And we had the similar hobbies of cooking. And although I did not enjoy her Pall Malls and coffee, but we just enjoyed each other. But it wasn't until I was a little bit older, and
Which is when you definitely needed it.
yeah, and so I would say my grandmothers were the two people that, one my whole life and one eventually, really saw that I had potential and would say, you can really do anything you want to do. And my dad's mom would sometimes say, "Don't listen to your dad." Or she would say, I had the same conversation with him when he was your age, and, you just got to go do what you got to do. And so, it was always interesting to talk to her about where I was at in life and kind of where he was at that same age. Because we both, I got pregnant when I was 16. He had a child when he was 17. So we both had that same situation in our lives. And she was like, don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He did the same exact thing. So she was kind of my lifesaver at that point.
I love that for a few different reasons. I love that you can now look back at your dad's situation and see how conflicted he was and why. I mean, it's not uncommon for a man to have that, feel threatened by a potential of a successful woman, especially if it's his kid, right, that he's so close with, especially back then. I think things are gradually changing in that way when it comes to traditional modeling. But at the time, for you to be able to look back and see his conflict, how he was conflicted and why, and be able to give him grace for that, knowing that he was both. He inspired you through spite. You knew that you could do better, and also through his support. That's what I took from that. Remember, at the very beginning of this, I said the stories we tell say a lot about who we are, and the stories we tell about other people say a lot about who we are. So the story you just told about how your dad influenced you says a lot about you and your ability to see things from that perspective and to allow that grace. Because what that says to me is that you can give grace to yourself when you see things that maybe you could have done differently. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize, like, my dad did not have an easy childhood. And the things that he experienced, he then brought forward into his fatherhood. He did not make good choices in our younger years. And as he learned to do better, he did better. And so, giving him that forgiveness as he learned those skills and as he changed as a person, he did that. He made the choice to change. And that's really important. Like, yes, he did the bad things, but he made the choice to become a different person later. So,
well, and you gave him the space and honor to do that, because a lot of us, we try to make those changes, but the people that are closest with us don't see those changes, don't accept those changes. I've heard people say people don't change, and I think that's bullshit. But we have to allow for that change. We have to support it and encourage it if we're seeing positive change in the people around us. So I love that you do that. We will come back to, well, you mentioned ACEs, and I'm sure that many of our listeners didn't know what you were talking about. So we'll come back to that when we start talking about how this applies to other people and how this conversation can maybe be used to inspire others. So Chris, when you think about those influences, I'm going to ask you the same question. Where were those, and how can you look back at them and see the value in those influences?
Yeah, I think the challenge for kids like me who grew up without a kind of supporting, loving environment, and also I think the most important thing is when you grow up without role models, it's really hard to navigate the world, right? And for me, I ended up kind of finding my role models through the stories of others. A lot of times it's like people that I've never met in real life. It could be the story through a book or through but it's like based on real people, right? And like I didn't grow up in the States. I grew up in a third world country, and I moved to the States, with 2 suitcases after college when I was 22. But I actually had that idea that I want to leave that what I consider to be a toxic environment, and I I don't know why, like even when I was, I think I was 14, but I had this idea, I don't want my future kids to go through the same kind of, things that I went through. And I also kind of relate to the idea that, or experience that, like, I don't doubt that my parents love me, but I think it's the, how they grew up. We talk about hurt people, or like, trauma or generational. So once I understand, and also just to be fair, like trauma is like very new, or the idea.
Our understanding of
Yeah,
it, right?
The research,
Right.
started in the 90s. So like and I was born in the 90s. So like when I was growing up, like maybe like they were like people don't even have the understanding of what trauma is. So sometimes I question if, when I started doing therapy, I'm like looking at my parents through a lens that I wonder if it's fair to kind of evaluate what they, how they raised me. Like, am I just holding them to a higher standard? I don't know. But like, what I do know is I do see sometimes like I have, we talk about the book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? Like your body will tell you, you had trauma. So, and back to, what we're talking about role models. I think around the age of 14, I think 14 or 15, I saw the movie, The Pursuit of Happiness. That movie really kind of, I don't know why, but like I was just so kind of inspired by that movie. I think that movie kind of, the story laid the foundation of, like I want to pursue my own American dream, and I eventually, got to where I am now. But that's just one example, right? Like that's one story. So that's more on, I grew up with poverty. And so like that was like how I kind of fight against like poverty, and then achieve kind of, there's the traditional kind of definition of success, which is more tied to, maybe it's more defined by like money and career and that kind of stuff, which I kind of pursued and did my share, but then I realized it's incomplete. It's like a small portion of, or like I was still deeply unhappy. It's the cliche story of, you pursued that route, and it's like, why am I still, feeling the same? And I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years, I started to kind of realize to focus more on things like building community. I spent a lot of time in nature. That's how we met. That's one thing that I found that really bring me peace and calm. I'm wearing an Alaskan Trapper hat. I'm like super into the story of Hemmelkorth. He's on the show, The Last Alaskans, and like seeing how, that family interact with each other. Like for me, that's my role model around what it means to have a family. What does love feel like? And again, it's really hard to navigate because like I remember when I was doing therapy, my therapist was like, "When do you ever feel loved?" I'm like, I couldn't give an answer. Like I'd never, yeah, like it's a foreign concept to me. So it's like, it's similar to Emily. Like I was really good at school growing up. Part of that I was also like, my mom was really hard on me. That was one of the primary reasons I would get, physically abused if I don't come home like number one in my class. Like there's discipline, which is like super high standard. And now I have to spend my whole life basically trying to develop self-compassion and tell myself like, it's okay. Like, you are getting like, I mean, I think the interesting thing is like a lot of times those things, like, you know, when Emily was talking about like being organized, like it's like a double-edged sword. Like I'm I'm a super hardworking person when it comes to a lot of things. Like I wake up every single day, 5:20, go to the gym. Like it's easy for me.
Disciplined. Mhm.
Yeah. It's like I don't feel like it's hard to do. It's just like it's part of me. But I think when it was forced on me, it was like my number one value is freedom. So when it was forced on me, it's a whole different, you know, story, right? Like it made me miserable, but like now I have agency. I decide to get up at that time and go to the gym. I decide to do this and that. So like having the agency and autonomy is super important, changes everything. But yeah, I find that you know, a lot of how I learned, like another thing is like my money, my parents never talk about money. So I had nothing, I knew nothing about money, right? Like, and the, like I still till this day feel grateful for this coworker friend. You know, we were grabbing lunch and then he's like 23, 24 at the time. And, you know, he started, you know, tell me about, you know, investment strategies and basically taught me to have a basic understanding of finance. And I was like, wow, like, you know, I like I was in my late 20s. I was like, I had no idea, had no concept of any of that. So like I had, you know, people in my life, but a lot of times also, you know, could be a person's story that I learned. Another thing is like I'm very nerdy. Like I just started reading Mindset by Carol Dweck for the second time. I think it's probably the most important book that I've read in the last decade. And I consider those people are my role models too, because they taught me how to navigate life. So I think that's my way of like those people kind of helped shape me. And now I have, you know, by consciously building community, now I have more like actual people in my life. I have a support system, like my neighbors, some of my friends. They like in the last few years, I started to feel like I'm not all alone in this world because I left my country, I left my family. Like I don't really have a like working relationship with my family. So like sometimes it could get really hard, but like
Lonely.
it's tough. Like you know, as an immigrant in a whole different country, but in the last few years, I started to feel like I have my own. Like literally, my neighbors came over the other day, and then she's like, you know, we're the family that you have here, and I just.
Did you cry?
Yeah,
I would have totally cried.
yeah.
So you bring up a really important point when it comes to our resilience, and that is choosing our community. And I think a lot of people don't realize they can choose their community based on their needs and who they want to be. I mean, I think about the people that I've surrounded myself with in the last 15 years, and I am really intentional about making sure that the people I spend the most time with help me feel good about myself and my personal growth, that there's some reciprocal arrangement of love and care. So, Emily, when you think about community and how you were able to move forward, especially as a pregnant 16-year-old, and choosing community like your spouse to make your life different from what it would have been otherwise. Again, we're looking at the things that went right to bring you to both of you to where you are.
Well, I think when I got pregnant at 16, I quickly made the decision to stop the behaviors that I was going down the wrong path. I had a lot of cousins and aunts and uncles that I had watched over the years going to prison, dying. I had several of my cousins who had already died by that age, and they were, they might have been 10 years older than me, but they had already overdosed and died. I had several cousins and uncles that were in and out of prison my whole childhood. And I had been on a pretty good path, and then all of a sudden took a detour and started down that path that my family was on. It didn't last very long, and I got pregnant, and I hit that wall, and I quickly decided not to continue down that path. I had a pretty big decision to make, either keep going or totally change my life. And I made the decision to stop doing all of the immature things I was doing. I was only 16, so doing immature things was normal, but it was, I quickly had to decide to
big consequences.
grow up.
Bigger for you than for most people at that age.
Yeah. So I did that. I graduated high school a semester early, started college in the fall. I continued to live with my family. So my oldest son really had like 5 parents, my sisters and my parents and me. And we didn't move out till he was 1. And I met my husband when Jacob was 2. So, and then that was a really interesting change in my life, because I come from that background of family members who are from the more criminal element. And my husband was a juvenile probation officer.
Oh. And how did you meet?
I came home one day and he was sitting on my stairs. He was I lived in an apartment building, and he was visiting my neighbor. We have a really funny whole story that we tell about how we met. But yeah, I just came home one day and he was visiting my neighbor, sitting on my stairs, and we would go to family functions, and literally all of my family would like go to one side of the yard, and we would be standing on the other side of the yard. I was like, oh. Like, okay, like, we're different. Like, I quickly realized we were different, and I had made a choice, like, to be different, and so it was kind of like Emily's not really invited to things anymore. So,
Ouch.
Yeah, it was interesting. It wasn't like I was uninvited, but it was just different, and
too awkward.
And then, as the older people in my family, and especially as my grandmothers passed away, that really changed the dynamic of the family anyway. Like, that's when people stopped really doing family things. And so people started to grow apart. But it was very clear that I had made a choice to not be a part of the family. And even though it wasn't with my parents, it was with the rest of the family. And so, yeah, that was interesting when I realized that one day we were at a family function and literally looked up and everybody was on one side of the yard. Whoa.
So when you think about once you met your husband and got married, what is the community that you built together to support that change? Because as Chris said, you can't really go it alone. You'll never find happiness. You may find success in money and material objects, but you're not going to find life satisfaction by searching for that exclusively. Being able to have a community to help support you in this decision to leave your family, it's that conscious decision to do something different. What was that like, building that community?
Well, we moved to Helena after our second son was born at the very end of 98, probably like today, 98. he was 2 weeks old, and we really didn't know what our plan was. We actually weren't married. We did everything backwards. We had kids. We're together forever. Bought a house. Then we got married. Like all the things, like we did everything sideways and backwards, and it was, we just did things.
By traditional standards.
Yeah. By
let's make sure we caption that. By traditional standards, that was backwards. But these days we take our own paths.
Yep, we did not the way normal people would think things go.
Traditional. I'm going to quibble with words here because at the beginning of this, I said the stories we tell matter. They shape our internal messages.
Yep.
And words matter. And when you say normal versus traditional, you can hear the difference. That's an important distinction. So I'm just going to quibble with you as you change your words and manage your language.
Yep.
All right. So you didn't take the traditional path.
Yeah, absolutely not. So we got to Helena and had our third kid right away. And for some reason, I thought I was going to go out and volunteer at Florence Crittenton Home, which is the home for pregnant teenage girls, because by then I was 22, 23, and I thought, oh boy, I've got some life experience now. I can go mentor these girls, as if I had any idea what I was doing with my own life. But they ended up hiring me for a job instead. And that was like day one of my path of doing nonprofit work, social work. It was just an interesting total detour of all the things I ever thought I would do with my life, because what I should have said at the beginning was actually everybody knows this about me, is what I used to say in high school was the last thing I will ever do with my life is be a social worker.
Famous last words, as they say. Never say never.
Well, I'm just curious, like, why did you think that way at the time?
But all my friends used to always say, I want to be a teacher or I want to be a social worker. And I was like, gross. That's the last thing I'll ever do with my life.
She was just being contrary. That was her contrary stage.
Yeah.
Well, and I was like, I really was like, why would I ever want to be a social worker?
Did you have experiences with social workers because of the way you were raised?
More so just the idea of it. Like, it was like, we don't talk to people outside the family, and you would never tell a social worker anything.
Right.
More that than actual experience with them. So,
for sure.
But yeah, so I started down that path, and that was really where I started learning about ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. And I really started working on myself, because one of my first mentors at Florence Crittenton, she was a therapist there. When we were working with the girls, she used to always say, don't ever go out on the floor and ask the girls to work on their issues if you're not willing to work on your own. And so it was a lot of looking inside yourself to figure out if you were on the floor, what was triggering you about that kid. Especially because I was that kid, really. Like I had something connected with every single one of those girls, because I was not much older than all of them. And, they were teenage moms, and we had so much in common. Like every one of them triggered me every day. And so it was a lot of inner retrospective, inner looking, so it was a lot of like, and that was really probably where I first realized that my childhood was not normal or traditional or what other people experienced. And where I first realized, like, holy crap, we were probably homeless. My parents actually were abusive. My parents are actually drug addicts. Like my parents and my sisters would argue with you today. When I told my sister the day my mom died, when I said something about my parents being drug addicts, she flipped out, because it's only marijuana. But when you look at Like when you're spending money you don't have on drugs, when you're spending hours of your day looking for drugs, when your family members go to prison for that reason, when you take in kids because your uncle's in prison and you're now raising 7 kids instead of 3 or 4 kids, that is drug addiction. Those things are related to drug addiction.
Yeah. When we first talked, you said when you're choosing drugs over feeding your children, that's addiction.
Over housing. Yeah.
Yeah. Over having a house, right?
And a house. Yeah.
Because you're purchasing drugs instead.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. When you're living in a motel and not a house, but you always have drugs, that is drug addiction. Even if it's just marijuana.
Right. It sounds like
epiphany.
Yeah. And it sounds like Florence Crittenton was really the beginning of your community building.
Yeah.
Because you started to realize that you had something to contribute, but you also had stuff to learn. And I continue to say, you can't have community if you're not contributing. Right. And it sounds to me like that's where you really started to discover that.
Yeah. And those people are still some of my very favorite people in the whole world.
Yeah. So let's bring this together. Let's wrap this up. I find that in general, our listeners are waiting for how do we apply this? And so I'm going to start with you, Chris, because you've been thinking about this. I can tell. I'm reading this in your face. When you think about, I'm going to do this from 2 different perspectives. From Chris, what do you say to a kid that is growing up in similar circumstances to yours? Now, in terms of finding the influences and coping skills that they need in a short, this is an option. Here are some strategies. What you would say to yourself as a child if you had that opportunity, or as a teenager. And then Emily, from the perspective of your social work knowledge and your choices that you made those years ago to get out, what do you say to those same kids from your perspective? So let's start with Chris.
That's a hard question. I think there are 2 ways to look at it. One is, what are you running away from? I might have heard of this from someone. Like, what are you running away from? And then I think it was Matthew McConaughey said this. And then you got to figure out what you're running towards too. Like, I was running from a toxic environment, my home, and all the, trauma and everything. But then it only got me so far.
You hadn't decided with intention what you're running toward, just what you're running away from.
Right. So, like, I moved to this country, I started, go to school, get a good job, try to be an adult. But then I started to feel really lost because I'm like, what am I going to do with my life? Now I don't have those tigers chasing me, metaphorically speaking, right? And then I have total freedom to everything. I have total control over my life, even though I still have to deal with, the trauma, the baggage and everything. But like, there's no one yelling me or telling me what to do with my life. And it's very liberating, but it's also scary because it's like, you got to do it all by yourself.
The path's wide open.
So I think, for a kid who's growing up, I think the biggest thing that you have is time. You still have so much of your life ahead of you. And you could feel like this is the end of the world. It's not. You're going to go through way harder stuff and you're going to be able to deal with it. Like, never underestimate yourself, but also you never know who you're going to turn out to be. So I'm still a work in progress. I'm still trying to figure out who I am, who I'm going to be. So, that's, my number one rule is like, always, you got to seek your truth. You got to seek truth in the world, and you got to seek your own truth. Like a lot of the stuff we talk about, like, the first thing we have to do is to face ourselves. Like what Emily did was to own her, own her story, own her journey. And then, right, like her sister was not facing the truth. I think those are sometimes the hardest thing in life, is to face your own truth. But that's also the best part. Once you own the truth, you could do something about it. And right, if
That's
you don't,
great advice.
right, if you don't acknowledge, like if I don't acknowledge, I think I have a drinking problem. I'm never going to work on it.
Right.
Because I don't have, yeah.
I'd like to kind of paraphrase this. What I'm hearing from you is that being introspective, being able to see what you're running from, identifying the specifics that you're leaving. This is what I'm leaving and why. And then being able to craft a vision for what you're running toward. And I think what I'd encourage our listeners to do right now is consider who they can influence in these ways. The students and young people in their lives, whether it's your neighbor or a kid that you run into at the library that you know is in a traumatic environment, because we all know students and children who are in toxic environments. Being there for them to help them identify those things of what they're trying to leave and what they want in their future, knowing that they have to reassess regularly, because what you wanted when you were 22, your goal by 25, I want to be making this much money, I want to be safe, I want to have a house, that changes as you noticed. And instead of creating an existential crisis of, oh my gosh, I've been working so hard to get to this goal and now I don't know what I want next, knowing in advance that you're still creating yourself, right? So I love that.
And I also want to call out that it doesn't just apply to kids. It applies to adults too. Like if you, like I started doing therapy and understand my trauma in my late 20s. And that kind of like made me, like in some aspect, right? Like you're re-experiencing your childhood, like through therapy, for example. So in a lot of ways, it's like in some aspects of my life, like I was, once I started to understand things like attachment theory, I started to understand how I behave in relationships. Like I was a kid again, like I was growing again, right? So like you could have, that's why you could have a fully functional adult in some aspects of their life, and then maybe they can't regulate their emotions when they're driving, or in a relationship, like they have, certain behaviors that seems confusing, and, their partners are like, I don't understand. And that
you're so capable over here.
Right.
Over here, I don't even know who you are. Yes.
So that's like, unresolved, could be unresolved childhood trauma, right? Like that's the space for you to learn to be curious about your own truth. And then once you understand, why do I behave this way? And then you can start to, either you decide to keep it, or you're like, I want to change it. Like that's up to you, but the understanding is the crucial part.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was great. And Emily, actually, I'm going to reassess your closing question, because from your experience as being one of those Florence Creighton girls, and then moving into this social work aspect of your career, what do you say to, I started down this path, but you're the credentialed person to do this. What guidance do you give to adults who have interactions with younger people? I mean, even in your 50s, having interactions with somebody in their 30s or their 40s or their teens. What do you say to them after this whole conversation about what went right? What guidance do you think you would give?
That's the funny thing. I still am not a social worker. Of all the degrees that I have, none of them are in social work. Which I sort of am still a little bit obstinate and did not go to the fourth degree.
A little bit. You did get something from your dad.
I actually have a bumper sticker on my wall about where I have a bunch of pictures and different random things from over the years that just says, remember who you wanted to be. Mm. And that's one of the things that I always think about when I'm talking to really anybody is, and it, kind of extends to remember who you needed when you were a kid. And, what did you need somebody to say to you when you were 16? Because when I was working with kids, it was like, if I was that kid and this old lady sitting across the table from me, what did I want her to say? Like, I don't want the old lady to tell me what to do. I want her to give me something that I can actually use. Like, so it's always like, if I was that person on the other side of the table, what do I need to hear right now? I don't need to be lectured at. I don't need to be told I'm a bad person. It's what do I need to hear? Whether it's, whether I'm the teen mom or I'm the employee who's getting in trouble or, whatever the case is, it's always in the back of my head. What does that person need from me right now? Like, so.
Yes. Put yourself back in that position. And if you can't, ask them. If you haven't ever been in that position, I'm not going to go to a pregnant 16-year-old and think I have any answers. I was never that person. But I can hold space for them. I can say, what do you need from me right now? I am here. I am ready to support. I know you can do this. How can I support you? So I love that, Emily. Thank you. That is so insightful. That's so insightful. So, thank you, both of you. This has been such an insightful conversation. So many great stories shared and important ones. For our listeners, I want to remind you to look up some of the tags, links that are in the show notes associated with this podcast episode at elkinsconsulting.com. So you can look up what ACEs are, which are adverse childhood experiences. And it's an assessment where you answer yes or no to questions about potential trauma that occurs in childhood and young adulthood, so that you can get your score and maybe uncover some of the reasons for some of your behavior that you're struggling with now. I'd encourage you to look up some of the authors that Chris mentioned, and don't hesitate to reach out and connect with these two amazing human beings to learn more about the content that they're sharing and what they're putting out there. Chris and Emily, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners, now it's your turn. What inventory are you going to take about what you ran from and what you're running toward? And who in your life needs to hear from you that they believe that you believe in them and that you're there to support them and help them move into whatever they're running toward. Thank you so much for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You. How you tell them will.
You must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.